So today we're going to be diving deep into the topic of screen time because as new parents, this is a topic that seems to somehow come up a lot in conversations with other parents. But it's also one that's very confusing and sometimes filled with seemingly contradictory research that's not always clear how to make sense of. It's also one that can be driven by a lot of fear and uncertainty rather than clarity and sound reasoning. So in this video, we'll be digging deep into exactly what is the research out there around screen time. And how can we make sense of this incredibly multifaceted phenomenon in society in the digital age that we live in? So, usually, when we think about reviewing academic research relevant for making informed parenting decisions, we think about disciplines like child psychology or neuroscience or what have you. And we'll definitely be getting into the research for those subjects shortly. But one of the disciplines that's perhaps underrated and extremely useful when making decisions about human behavior is actually to start with research from historians. Because whether it's digital screen time or radio wave time or dead tree time or even papyrus time, right, talking about the physical form in which media is delivered and then having fears about how it affects our children is a discussion that's been going on for multiple millennia. Socrates, for one, was vehement about how damaging teaching children to write could be, lamenting about how promoting literacy in children would destroy their ability to effectively memorize oral stories. And all the historians I've been able to talk to have said that this quote does capture not just Socrates' point of view, but that of the typical person living at that time. And anthropologists find that it even represents the sentiment of many people living in non-literate cultures today. So naturally, most of the statements made by other people with this viewpoint at the time weren't written down, and it's hard to get perfectly accurate records from back then. This one we're fortunate to have because Plato did eventually write it down, but it does seem to reflect the kind of feeling of the time. But one thing that's important to recognize is that this quote of his, it's not technically incorrect. If we look at the ability of kids in non-literate societies, their ability to memorize and retell oral stories verbatim is remarkably higher than probably any of the kids you know today. So when Socrates complains essentially of how granting kids excessive amounts of, let's call it here, papyrus time, if we had to come up with a term equivalent to screen time, but referring to reading and writing back then, so how all of this so-called papyrus time the kids were being exposed to would rot their brains and make them lazy and complacent and unable to do all the things that he can do that made him so successful. He's technically not wrong, but today we can see, even though his quote is technically correct, just how much it misses. And if we continue forward, all of these fears didn't go away anytime soon after Socrates. Fears of the written word remained extremely strong for millennia, like such that only a few centuries ago, parenting guides were routinely talking about how dangerous exposing kids to books and reading was, how lazy people who read are, and how much it corrupts the body and mind. You can pause the video and read any of these examples on the screen that you'd like, but overall, the general assumption we have today that exposing kids to lots of books and reading is a good thing was not at all the case in earlier times. Far from it. Like today, if somebody were to ask you about the personality of your child, and you were to reply, "Oh, he's a real bookworm," that's not something you'd really need to say with shame attached to it. Like, in fact, you might even say it with pride. Or you might even get a response from the other parent like, "Oh, wow, how did you do that? He's going to grow up to be so smart. You know, he may even become president one day." Or like an interaction like that wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility if you were to have a kid whom you describe as a real bookworm. But during Abraham Lincoln's time, being a bookworm was often used as an insult. Like in a Chicago Tribune editorial, they wrote how, quote, "Lincoln is a bookworm. He's too intellectual and inexperienced to be president." The New York Herald straight up wrote, "Lincoln is a bookworm. He's not fit to be president." And Stephen Douglas and all his political opponents would repeatedly refer to him as a bookworm in order to portray him as being sort of this out of touch, delusional person that was associated at the time with somebody who spent too much time reading. And this wasn't just a problem in his adult life. In Michael Stevens' book, The Rise of the Image, The Fall of the Word, he talks about how, quote, "the young Abraham Lincoln's neighbors reportedly thought he was lazy because he spent so many hours buried in his books," end quote. So if we take a step back for a second and imagine what it must have been like for Abraham Lincoln to raise a bookworm during a time when there were very divided opinions in the parenting community about if that was a good thing, and his neighbors were making comments about how lazy they were letting him become. We can imagine how overcoming that kind of atmosphere required a certain level of conviction and deep reflection among his parents about what they felt was a good upbringing for their child and determination to work towards that. And this isn't exclusive to times long ago. Even within the last 100 years, some of the most popular and authoritative parenting advice was advising that kids should be actively prevented from reading before the age of 6 in order to improve ocular function. Although current research shows that early reading actually can benefit rather than harming developing eyes. And spoiler alert to our modern day times, if you poke around at either the research journals or even just videos on YouTube, you'll find lots of great neuroscientists and vision researchers who talk about their research demonstrating how playing action shooter video games improves both visual processing and ocular function, as well as attention and productive forms of multitasking. So anyway, if you want to go further into historical context, understanding the patterns of how a society goes through each time a new media form is invented, the BBC's put out a really great short special on the history of media panic. You can watch that from the links in the description, or continue on to part 2 of the series, where we'll look at modern day research